Thank you. Everybody can hear me? Hopefully it doesn't die on me again. And thank you for all of you in the last talk that I didn't scare off and you came back. My name is Stephen Scarbrough. All my friends call me Scribs, though. So if you have a question, I will answer that. My wife calls me a bunch of other names that I answer to as well. If you hit one of those, I might think she's here. Today we're going to talk about industrial control systems and the silent target in cyber warfare. And when I say silent target in warfare is because how many of you are actually in like offensive cyber or defensive cyber? A few folks. I can tell you that we don't normally talk about industrial control systems when we're talking about conducting, cyber warfare and defending those pieces. I mean, recently we've been talking about it a little bit in the public, but on the DoD side, not so much. It's mainly when we say offensive cybersecurity or defensive cyber, we're talking about enterprise type support things, right? Email servers, routers, switches, all those other things. But there's a plethora of other targets out there that we need to defend and have potentially as targets. Who's familiar with all the 16 critical infrastructure areas? 2 of you, so I'm going to ask you guys all the questions. Thanks for the volunteer. So, 16 critical infrastructure areas and that we've identified to kind of like group them all into those different pieces. We're not going to talk about every one of them, but there are some scary ones there that we just don't think about. How many of you remember Oldsmar? Anybody know what Oldsmar is? Oldsmar, Florida, 2 years ago. There's an attack on a water treatment facility in Oldsmar. It's right outside of Tampa. Right? We don't think about our water system as being something that's compromisable. But in their case, they had configured the system. Some of the engineers wanted to gain remote access to it because they didn't want to have to work on site. So they set it up a back door, basically, and somebody found it. Bad guys. Go figure, right? Somebody got into it, and the only reason they found it was the operator was in there, and he saw the mouse moving. Kind of goes back to when the Ukrainians saw the mouse moving, and not before the power got shut off, right? It's two OT attacks that were stopped by somebody witnessing mouse moves on a screen. But they got in, and he was moving the mouse to go over to like adjust the level of lye in the water, and could potentially cause a lot of harm, right? By increasing the lye in that water for that community. And not just in that community, what else happens if a small community within a larger municipality comes under attack? What happens? Anybody? Well, I guess everybody distrusts the water system of the surrounding area. And the last talk I was talking about, if you really wanted to throw a city or a municipality into a state of complete disarray, attacking the medical system would be one of them. And not just like a hospital itself, but if you could get in and you could do something like expire medication, like insulin. Imagine, the city of New York or San Francisco or even other small cities like Atlanta and stuff. You expire all the insulin or all the, you take all of the Ozempic out of production in a city, right? It throws it all into complete disarray. And if the guy came back and said, it was actually a breach and you should be able to trust it, is anybody going to trust it? Probably not. So it causes a lot of different problems. Healthcare, water, information technology, right? We all know that one. Dams. I'm going to show you as one of the examples, dams. How many of you think of dams on a daily basis? Raise your hands. Nobody, right? I'm going to show you, it's going to be, when I first found it, it was pretty scary to think about. I've shown other people, and they're like, that's not funny. And I'm going to show you a couple other things as well, but, right? IT versus OT, right? In industrial control systems, you're going to hear me swap back and forth between a lot of different terminology and everything else. OT, operational technology, encompasses industrial control systems, IoT, IIoT, MIOTT, whatever other alphabet you want to talk about that's not enterprise IT, right? Anything else that goes along with that is traditionally thought of as operational technology, whether it's in a facility that's producing car parts, doing food preparation, hospital, power generation, any of those other things. In this building right now, how much OT technology do you think there is? There's a lot, right? The HVAC system, who we all love dearly, especially this time of the year with humidity and heat outside, right? Actually, at my house, I'm getting a brand new air conditioning today. My wife loves me. So all those different things. Anybody remember the Target attack? Way back when? It talked about millions of customers' data being stolen and everything else. Do you know how that was perpetrated? HVAC system. Contractor came in, did work on the HVAC system, somehow left a back door over to the point of sale system and the internal network, and they were able to traverse into it. I'm going to show you how that's done, right? And how simple it is to do that. I got an example for you. But the IT piece, right, is what we normally think of. The HVAC and everything else is what we traditionally attack. I just got back from DEF CON this week. Last week we were in the aviation village or aerospace village. We have like a runway lighting system in a box. People can hack and defend and everything else. And people just don't think about it. Like, that's not something I would normally think about going after, right? Those types of pieces. But tell me, what's an essential item that you have to run all the IT infrastructure? Power. You have to have cooling, right? Humans have to have lights, right? They have to have all these different things. They have to have access to the spaces, right? So if you can attack any one of those and take those down, right, at any point, then you can disable 100% of the IT infrastructure, right? You can force things to happen that you want to happen, right? And it may not even be to, some people think, well, if you just shut it all down, well, what if I don't necessarily want to shut it down? Maybe if I'm an adversary that just needs you to restart your computer for me to execute a secondary payload or something. If I just can flip the lights off, flip the power off and flip it back on, or attack the HVAC system to get it just warm enough to where you start initiating graceful shutdowns. That's all I need to do. And who in the room is going to think anything of it other than I need to call facilities and get an HVAC technician out because it's hot as crap outside and my HVAC is not working all that well, right? So little things that can be hidden inside of there, again, that we don't think about and that we don't normally think is a necessary attack could be a possible attack, right? And that's just what this slide, right? The OT side enables IT. It doesn't mean that we don't need IT, but in the grand scheme of things, when we're looking at infrastructure from both the offensive and defensive side, OT to me takes a higher precedence. And how much of it do we focus on? Very little, right? And that's because I'm going to ask a bunch of questions, and I don't expect a bunch of hands to raise because they didn't happen in the last one. Any SOC operators? One. All right. Second volunteer. As a SOC operator, how many alerts do you get from the traditional enterprise on a daily basis? Too many, right? If I add in thousands of more from the OT side, which ones are you going to prioritize? Yeah, you might prioritize and everything else, right? The hundreds, the thousands of other SOC operators and facility operators and everything else and network operators, you add those pieces into it. If they're there, he said something that was very critical there. If you're monitoring the OT side of things, right? They look at it and they're like, well, should I respond to the phishing email or should I respond to this thing over here that says there's a Modbus flood or there's a misconfigured Modbus thing? I don't know what Modbus is, but I know what that phishing thing is. I'm going to go do this, right? And so that Modbus error, that Modbus flag that gets thrown might be something that's getting ready to be a huge problem, right? Depending on what you have in your infrastructure. And I say that jokingly, but I think I took it out of here. But a couple years back when we started talking about this, anybody from the South Carolina Guard? One? Awesome. We get to make fun of them. We found in some research we were doing a PLC, a controller for a facility in South Carolina. And the reason I found it was I was scanning through some results, and the installer, the integrator in this case, had done me a huge favor by calling it Adj General. Like Adjutant General, right? The Adjutant General of South Carolina. So I start looking at it, gave me an address in the device. It said Dalzell, South Carolina, because that's where that contractor worked at, or lives at, his business out of. So somebody at the state of South Carolina had contracted this individual to go and update the facilities control device in the Adjutant General's building. And lucky for me, too, that he'd done it at 2 other places, the exact same configuration, and had named them similar to the Adjutant General ones. So he'd given me like this blueprint of what the Adjutant General building's capabilities were, right? One was in a civilian building with 0 IT support. The other one was in an Adjutant General building. So as an adversary, I could play whatever I want with in the other building and then pivot to the Adjutant General building, right? We called them up, and the security staff, the IT guys were like, that's not our network, that's whose? Facilities. And we were like, well, transfer us to facilities. And facilities says, no, that's got an IP address, that's IT's, right? So it goes back and forth on what it is, and the whole time, it's sitting out there and it's available to adversaries, right? Because we just don't understand those types of pieces. The IT department doesn't understand it. Anybody that does anybody's facilities? One person? When you go and you buy pieces off the internet or you try and procure things, supply chain interdiction stuff, right? Supply chain trust, those types of things. We don't normally inspect those pieces. It's a big issue now that we're starting to hear more and more rumbling of, but you normally don't go and say, hey, inspect these devices, I need to change the light switches. When they built our labs 2 years ago, I don't have electrical cable going to my light switches in my lab. It's all Cat5 cable, right? And all those switches have IR readers on them, so I can program the brain, and that brain is connected to the facilities owner's network, and the facility owner can control my lights from any place that they're connected to. So the light switch now becomes part of, the OT becomes part of the infrastructure and everything else. It can give me access into the IT side of things as well. So the industrial control system is composed of many different components. In the world of IT infrastructure, how many companies make switches? A handful, right? We can name the big ones. There's some other ones that are out there. They're like knockoffs and everything else, but we know who the big name players are. We're not going to call Cisco out or anything on it, right? Right? Their infrastructure. But all those different components and everything else become exploded out when we start talking about control systems. Because now we're talking about light switches. We're talking about the brains that drive those. We're talking about all the interconnects in between all the different pieces of it. Right? We're talking about HMIs. Who knows what an HMI is? Human machine interface. It's the GUI that we operate equipment with, right? We have a touch panel. I'm going to show you one here in a minute, right? To control all these different aspects of it, all those different things, OPCs, historians, all the different components that make up the industrial control environment all now become highly targetable, right? And need to be defended, but it's what we do to automate our buildings and everything else to make our lives comfortable, right? There are literally thousands upon thousands of different components out there. The big names in this environment are Siemens, Allen Bradley, I don't want to say knockoffs, but like lower level ones like Click PLCs. Anybody ever hear of Click PLCs? Click PLCs, it's it's not a low grade, but it's a cheaper version of some of these things. That depends on what you're integrating into it. They do everything from control water systems to HVAC systems to lights to actuators. I'm going to show you here in a few minutes, I keep saying this, but some examples. I want you to see these examples. They control everything. I have a car wash that I own, that I should say, pwned, right? And all the actuators in it are controlled by different components within the car wash, right? So each one of those now becomes some sort of thing we can get to. Now, when we talk about these components being on the network, there's a lot of different things that we have to think about. Just like a PC, right? They have a lot of different components, right? So how does it communicate, right? Is it wireless connected? Is it a serial connection? Is it Ethernet? Most of these are over Ethernet. They have different protocols that are running on it. Main ones that you're going to ever hear is Modbus, Profibus, right? This little controller down here, the Siemens controller, it was the bane of my existence for about a week at one point, because on the device itself, it has an Ethernet port, right, for TCP communications. On the port itself, it actually has a MAC address printed on it, because they're really helpful that way. When you power it on, you plug it into your network, and we started doing Wireshark captures against it just to see what it was, what it looked like and everything else. It drove me mad because the MAC address I was seeing in the packets was exactly 1 digit off from the MAC address that was printed on the device itself. It's because Profibus was on it, and what they do is they assign 2 MAC addresses to the NIC card. The TCP communications use 1 MAC address, Profibus uses the other one. Does anybody see how maddening that can be? It's crazy. It took me about 4 days, and after reading the RFP on it, understanding how it actually functioned and why it did it that way. So if we take cyber defenders, right, and move them into these environments, aside from just looking at logs, but how do we do assessments as well, right? How do we go in and do these different types of things? Along with the thousands of devices, how many integrators do you think there are in the world? Hundreds of thousands. And if you want to see a standards nightmare, right, you should go to one of their meetings, because they don't have any. They don't have standards by what they do. The manufacturers have standards they build stuff out to, and they'll put pieces into it, like there's a default username and password on the HVAC controller. How many integrators in the world do you think actually change the default username and password when they install it? Very few, right? So getting it on there. How many in the IT staff did they install those in, actually go and do an assessment? How many of you ever heard of doing an SSP for an HVAC system? You don't do an SSP for an HVAC system. You don't have an ISSO in the world that knows anything about HVAC system communications, right? They might know how to turn it on and off. No, I shouldn't say that. There are probably some, but very few that would look at it as that's part of my information system infrastructure, right? So all these different pieces, and you put all that in there. Another nightmare is the maritime environment. Any sailors? I'm the only sailor in here besides, or you just don't want to raise your hand and be made fun of like me? If you've ever looked at a cruise ship, how many of you been on a cruise ship before? When they build cruise ships, they bring in hundreds and hundreds of contractors to integrate systems into it. And they will not have the same standard. The ship's communication system that it does for industrial control systems is sitting adjacent to the same Wi-Fi and infrastructure that they give to cruise passengers to be able to access to you. And there's no standards in what type of equipment they want to put into it, because they don't inspect that. They're like, I need a wireless network. Contractor puts the wireless network on it, right? The CISOs for those companies try to put some sort of standards on it, but where do you think they focus their efforts at? Enterprise support to the ship and to the company, right? All the actuators, all the control systems that are running the engines and the HVAC systems and everything else on that ship doesn't really have a standard configuration and safety piece to it, right? Anybody see the recurring trend I'm getting at? From both offensive and defensive sides of things, right? Here's our friends at the Marine Corps base in Camp Pendleton. And we were doing some digging around and everything else, and this was actually in one of their pamphlets. They were talking about how they were converting over to be, very energy efficient, green compliant leads. They had this in their pamphlet. We were able to go out on the internet and find the actual picture because they posted it out, right, and left it up there. There's vital information on here, right? You can see in the previous photo, there's no, it doesn't tell you where it's at. Like the MCB stuff has been redacted off of it. You notice that they edited the device type and some other information on it. Let me click over. You can see Intron Sentinel, right? The numbers on there, I actually identify it. There's a MAC address in there. So you can see the smart meter, right? Identify it. We post a lot of this information out because we don't understand the ramifications of what's actually going onto the system. Right? Uh-oh. Who uses Shodan? Everybody ever seen Shodan before? All right. This is a lot better than the last crowd. They were pretty cool, but they didn't have any like actual operators in there, or at least they didn't say they were. So I call this Google for hackers, right? It does a lot of web crawling, and it finds interesting things on the web. And one of the main things you can find on it, besides IP cameras that they haven't changed their default username and password, you can find all kinds of cool stuff. In this case, we're looking for specific ports, right? That's a little small, but here's our agent and general configuration, right? Do an IP address. We were looking for BACnet. It gives us all the IP information that's up there. You see where it says agent and general, or ads general -NEA1, and the description is agent general. I just didn't want you guys to think I was making that up. It's a real thing. They've actually done pretty good. They've taken it down now, so it's not up anymore, or it's not, at least not been scannable for a while. Right? This is what the device looks like. That actually is, right? It's for controlling. It's an Ethernet-based controller, so it can control the lights and a couple other systems inside of the building. When we found it, we kind of did, again, we kind of went through it and did some OSINT, right? Said it was in Dalzell. At first, I thought it was actually on Fort Jackson, at his compound on the backside. They moved at some point to downtown Columbia, right? And it was actually in there. The other place that it was installed at was the Army National Guard Museum that's right there. And then the other one was at a museum downtown, right, to be able to get into it. Now, here again, you're thinking like, so what? Well, this gives me a great access into that network, into that building, to be able to do whatever I want to that building. How hot does it get in this area? It's very hot. If I want everybody to leave the building, I just turn the AC off. Guess who's going home? Right? Do it on a Friday. Guess who's not coming back? Right? Airports are another area that we see a lot of stuff in. Right? What's in the room here? We have a lot of military. What's something we always do when we're doing planning for some operation? Where's the nearest airport? How do I get supplies in and out by air? Right? Guess what our adversaries do? Strategic points are our airports. At Hartsfield Airport, how many people do you think go in there on a daily basis, coming in and out? Anybody?
It's like the second largest airport in the United States.
Yeah. I think it's almost in the world. It's about 250,000 people a day that are transported through there. I think it came down a couple years ago. It was almost like 100 million people a year flow through there. And I think this year it was like 80 million people so far, like with COVID and all the other garbage and everything else. But they're attacking. Our adversaries are going after them. SFO, San Francisco Airport, was out for a while. Figured out it was the Russians who had gotten in and done some other things. But there's tons of stuff. Air traffic control systems. And not just our adversaries, but about a month or so ago, there was a huge outage on the East Coast. Everybody was stuck. Does anybody know why? There's a fire at a radar system inside of Virginia, and it shut down all the air travel in and out of Washington, D.C., which did what? Shut down most of the air travel on the East Coast, right? For, I think it was almost for like 4 hours it was shut down, right? We can't say that it was an adversary that did it. We don't know, but imagine now that I know as an adversary, if I can spark something like that, I can take some things down, right? The complexity of the aerospace ecosystem is tremendous. When we think about IT infrastructure and OT infrastructure living side by side, and I will tell you that airports are not the most secure place in the world, right? Not just from like a physical aspect, but from a network aspect. Anybody from Huntsville, Alabama? One person, good. We were talking at Huntsville, Alabama airport one day about doing some of the stuff for them and doing an assessment and everything, and their CISO was getting ready to retire, and we asked, who's going to take over? why you guys find out somebody new, and they're like, oh, the CEO is actually going to take over the CISO role. And we're like, well, what? Nothing against CEOs, but that's probably a bad idea. You probably need to get somebody else, right? So they just don't think about it. Even the operational side of things, one of the sheer complexity of the entire environment, right? TSA finally came out this year and said, hey, we're going to start initiating some regulations. You're going to have to you have to identify a cybersecurity person that has to be able to be reachable within 24 hours a day. You have to report any incidents in your facility within 24 hours. You have to follow this piece. Guess who they didn't mandate that for? Like small municipals and lower. They only did it for like major airports. And why? Because they know they don't have the facilities for it. They don't have the resources at those places, right? And some of them don't even. Some municipal airports don't even have CISOs, right? They don't have the sustained staff. Some municipalities that run local airports, everything, just have like a part-time guy that goes over and that keeps the network up, right? Which is horrible, right? When we start thinking about flying in and out of some place. But the entire piece, like I pointed out, like the Hartsfield Atlanta airport, right? All those operations and all the OT pieces. And as we go to more autonomous vehicles, think about how many autonomous ground vehicles are on the runway or going to be on the runway as they become smart airports, right? And how many tenants. Does anybody know who the tenants report to at an airport for IT stuff? No one. They can bring in whatever they want. They set it all up and everything else. They're getting on their network, their point of sale system. So all those different pieces, the number of users going through there, again, 250,000 people a day. How many devices a day is that, do you think? That's almost 1 million devices a day. If you think about like myself, because I'm a super nerd, right? I got a laptop. I've got my phone. Well, I got two phones. I got a work phone and a personal phone. I got an iPad. I got my flipper. I got like 3 or 4 other things I carry. Yeah, your watch, right? So I've got a ton of devices with me. You see a family of 4 going through. Each kid's got an iPad to keep them quiet, right? All those different things now become part of that infrastructure, right? The OT side of things and the IT side of things to get to them, right? I'm going to get through this. This is something interesting. Again, I go back to my Shodan piece. You can actually go to Shodan. We did this because when I was in the Navy, I flew. I was an air crewman. And one of the things, you have to have, what do you have to have when you fly? Fuel. So I was like, well, I wonder if I could find jet fuel, right? So I did a search for Jet A. And I get back a return for it, and it's a device, right? And it actually tells me, right, the intake inventory for this airport's fueling system. So you can see there's Jet A T2, T3, MoGas for motor gas, like for vehicles, like ground vehicles, and diesel, right? So we can see how much gas they have inside of there. The more disturbing piece with it is, on the top there, you see where it says the MAC address in the software version. It says press to enter setup mode. Oh, dear. And this is for a major airport in the United States. We were actually briefing this to an organization in D.C., and they called the operator, the COO, and was like, hey, we're going to put you on a phone call with Scribs. He's going to tell you what the problem is. And I had to walk him through and show him. He's like, oh, well, it's the intake monitoring system. I'm like, yeah, but I can do a man-in-the-middle attack against it and show you that your tanks are empty. You're going to buy a bunch of gas, and guess what? Anybody know what gas stations have to do if they buy gas? They have to put it in the ground because they buy it from a company. They contract somebody to deliver the gas, and if they can't put it in the ground, they got to pay the truck driver to hold the gas, right? Or do it in the reverse. Same thing with these. Do it in the reverse. Be like, hey, I've got plenty of gas, and they go to get gas out of it to fuel up airplanes, and guess what they don't have? Gasoline. The other thing with this, too, is well, let me go back. It tells me what type of device it is, the Lantronix X90. Cool little device. It's a serial to IP or a serial to TCP converter. On that little device there, you just plug it in your Ethernet, plug in your serial, connect and everything else. It's got a mail server and a web server on it. Now, I find these all over the country, at mom and pop gas stations, at airports, at farms, right? Because it's a really easy way to monitor your gas. You can do it from your phone, stick it into a web app or something, get that information into it. The problem with it is not only could I get in and do all those other things, but I could see some other communications that was going to and from it. And actually, this device was sitting on the same network as that intake monitoring system had been accessing it. And Shodan had done me a favor and done a screen capture of it, and it gave me the username and the admin name for the person on the network. So by finding the intake monitoring system, I was able to now escalate over to a device in the network, find all the other tanks, and then gain access potentially into their network on their IT infrastructure. So jump from OT to IT and back and forth, right? Guess how many people monitor intake monitoring systems? Zero. They don't even understand that what they're doing other than, hey, they get those gas pieces. Shodan is also really nice to me because it showed me all the CVEs that are associated with that device. So now I not only found the intake monitoring system and I found a launch point to be able to get into it, but they were nice enough to tell me, hey, try these first, Steve, right? Because this is some of the problems. Here's an integration file. I think I'm going to just jump out. Yeah, so I'm going to show you this on my iPhone in just a second. And I'm going to show you how easy it is. So do another search for a touch panel. Everybody's seen a touch panel before, right? On a wall. Got a nice little HMI on it and everything else. So I just did a search for semantic. Go and I'm an Apple fanboy. Right? So I only use MacBooks. I hate Windows machines nowadays, or for quite some time. And it wouldn't let me connect to it. It let me get to this page, but if I try to go further, it told me, hey, you can't do that, but there's an app in the App Store for you. I'm like, oh, so I get to use my iPhone now, right? So go and download this Siemens Connect, this smart client app. And bam, I'm into an HMI. I'm going to switch over really quick here. Let's see. Make sure I get this running here. So you're actually looking at my phone right now. There's a smart client up here. I'm going to open it up. Pop in the IP address. I did a quick research for the user manual for that device. Put in the username and password from the default. And now I'm on the device itself. This is live. This is a car wash in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Right? We can click into it. And we can actually see it's operating right now. All the green pieces are actually the arms and the actuators working inside of there. If we go back out to the main menu, we can see there's a setup menu that goes into the actuators, like shooting like the waters and hydraulics. On the other page, I could have taken over manual control and just had that car sit there until I'm done with it. Won't do that to them today. They don't need that. You see this, though? This integrator put in this nice little pager tab. And that's so that most integrators will want their operators to know if something goes wrong, right? Not working, not functioning. Puts in a broadband internet connection hooked to a touch panel, right? Gives us some information, everything else. And poking around on it, you see that the only place in this whole HMI, there's an exit button. You push the exit button, you would think you would go back out to the main page on the touch panel. You're in a Windows CE environment. I just got into his entire network. His point of sale system and everything else is mine. All from my phone. All because of the touch panel. Right? Now, from an adversarial point of view, that's super. I didn't have to do anything complex to hack into the system. Right? That's just a simple jump and escalate across there. Now, the adversarial standpoint of it is, this is on a major thoroughfare in Fredericksburg, Virginia. It's right off of 95, not even a half mile. What is just north of Fredericksburg, Virginia? Anybody know? Quantico. You know how many people from Quantico live in Fredericksburg, Virginia? A lot, because it's super cheap, right? So now that I'm in that network, now as an adversary, if I want to implant something in and just wait for users to go through the car wash while they're getting their car scrub-a-dub-dubbed, not thinking anything else, I can implant that stuff in. It's also surrounded by other facilities. I can actually see other networks surrounding. There's actually a Starbucks in the same parking lot. What does Starbucks do? Anybody? Free Wi-Fi, right? Anybody see the picture I'm painting? Where did my brief go? Give me a second here. Go. Get back to where we're at. So other cool stuff we could do with that one. Now, it wasn't just that one. What you're looking at now is the same type of device, right? But this is at a facilities in Palestine. It's a building. You see his hot water system. I can see his premium floors. There's his HVAC settings, cold water. I like the paradise floors. That's pretty cool, right? Premium dining area, more advanced settings. So this is his entire facilities control for this building in Palestine, right? You can go in and manipulate all the settings and everything else from. Same touch panel, different integrator, same default username and password, right? From around the world, right? Here's another scary one. Make sure we're still on track here. Yeah. How many of you think about dams on a daily basis? Right? I think I asked that earlier. Not daily, but often, right? One of the things that we do in America, right, in the States here, is we mandate what? A lot of data sharing, right? We mandate that the U.S. government and local municipalities share a lot of unneeded data, right? For whatever reason, this is one of them. So this is a national inventory of dams, right? And it goes back to the 1800s of information that dams were established. It has their current state, what the last time they were inspected, when the last time they had a violation, if the violation was corrected, all these other different things, right? I'm going to jump out again. I'm going to show you how easy it is to find targets. Any data scientists or data analysts in the room? A couple. You guys like Jupyter Notebooks? They're fun, right? I'm going to show you in like 5 lines of code, or like 16 lines of code here. So I can go out to the site here, right? And this is the inventory database. If I go over here to more, I'm going to show you how easy they make this. There's data downloads. There's the documents. There's an advanced map. There's a developer API, right? So we can gather data. We can actually use it and build our own applications from it. As an adversary, I don't necessarily want to create a mobile app for the dam inventory, but what I do want to do is I'm going to pull in a couple packages in Python, right? I'm going to read. I've downloaded just so it's easier here locally. I'm reading that data in, and I'm creating a data set, a data frame for latitude, longitude, and hazard potential classification of all the dams in the United States. Because they put it right in there for me, right? Yep, I'm going to scroll up. So then here's the code. Here's 15 lines of code. Here's a map that we can generate of all the dams in the U.S. And it builds within about 30 seconds. We can scroll down here. There's Augusta. It has 683 dams in this area. I'm going to show you something here really quickly. Look at Fort Gordon. I usually use my mouse, but it's being a little... There's a bunch of dams on Fort Gordon itself, right? it's showing me all of them. But as an adversary, I'm probably not really interested in every one of them. So what I did was I just added an if statement into my code down here on the bottom and rerun it. And now this is just simply saying, pull it in, and if the hazard potential classification is high, right here, map just those. Here's all the potential high hazard dams in the U.S. Let's see, there's Augusta. There's good old Fort Gordon. It's got 3 just on Fort Gordon themselves, right? Anybody see potential there? Now I know exactly what dams I need to get. And this one right here is that lake right before you go into the front gate over there. And there's houses and stuff right downstream from it. Right? There's a bunch of different things right there. Right? Those are tied into like the water treatment facilities. Like our water treatment facilities are part of dams. Right? I'm not going to point out all those to you, but they're in there. They're tied into it. So if I was to attack it and attack their critical infrastructure piece to it, right? And their systems, they're running those dams, and I could flood the water system, or I could flood the houses and everything else on the south side or the north side of Fort Gordon there. It create a lot of havoc, right? It may not be my ultimate goal. Maybe I want to get on base. Maybe I want to do something else, but I can create a lot of distraction with that, right? And if we scroll back out, I'm going to show you how many hazardous dams there are in the U.S. Right? So from an adversarial standpoint, it's called what? Target-rich environment, right? That we don't think of on a daily basis, right? And they're out there. We actually found another one. Anybody know what Superfund sites are? It's not a hazardous condition. It's a potential for, if something was to happen to the dam, the damage to the local community is high, right? So potential loss of life, loss of operations, a bunch of other things with it, right? In that data set too, it says the last time it was checked, and I did some digging last night, and I'm not going to share it, but it actually has the response plans available, so I know exactly as the adversary what the response plan is for that. Right? So I know what the plan is if I did attack it. Anyway, that's a horrible idea, right? So a Superfund site, any place in the United States that's been deemed to have some sort of chemical or stuff in the ground that's not good for us, like it's an EPA database. The EPA shares that data with everybody in the United States and everybody in the world. So we know exactly where Superfund sites are, and I can pull those in and map those and say, map all the Superfund sites adjacent to dams with high hazard ramifications and potentially flood Superfund sites and cause a bunch more havoc. So it just kind of like escalates out from there, right? And those different pieces. Let me see. Any questions so far? Bing, 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 bing. All right. So here's some questions you should be asking yourself, right? As organizations, as leadership, as like operators in the environment, whether you're, it's primarily focused at like defensive side of things, but you can extrapolate the offensive side as well, right? From like the ICS, OT, IoT side of the house, right? Operators and stuff should be asking, do I have, right, the people to manage to sustain those pieces. And that's not from a facility side, that's from an OT side of the house, right? Do I have my SOC folks trained to be able to monitor the networks? Am I monitoring my networks? Anybody name a intrusion detection system or some sort of security? What's that? Well, Elastic's a seam. We can firewalls, those types of things. You know any companies that build those? Can you name any industrial control system monitoring companies? No, Zomi. Yeah.
Question, right? So whenever we're getting into this discussion about ICS, so I have a strong stance with like data and systems. So the proper controls surrounding these should still exist regardless, right? So you leverage certain security controls in the network to facilitate X, Y, Z, depending on whether it's host all the way to bound level, right? So I think that just looking at it in the same regard for ICS is applicable.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
So not specifically for ICS, but those technologies do exist to limit access control, et cetera, to assets that are network, right?
Right. They do exist. I'm not saying that they don't. I'm just saying that we don't normally think about them that way. Like Nozomi, Dragos, everybody knows Dragos. Everybody's heard Dragos. Really great companies. I know people that work there, work with the good folks and everything else. You know, really great stuff. They're mainly focused on, like, I'll tell you, Dragos, mainly focused on the oil and power companies, right? Not facilities monitors. They have neighborhood watch that you can put out and everything else, but it's doing data generation. The other thing with it too is we're just talking about like the network monitoring piece. There's also like firmware, pulling firmware off, monitoring those connections, disconnected devices that are over, you know, a lot of implementers and a lot of companies and everything else will have disconnected devices that they're monitoring from the field on like a 5G connection, right? That doesn't necessarily fall into their network monitoring system, right? So there's a lot of different complexities that go along with it, but having that understanding, like we send our cybersecurity folks to enterprise cybersecurity defense classes, and there's a very small community. I used to go to the DHS Joint ICS Working Group, and they would have semi-annual meetings all over the country, and you would see the same 200 to 300 people at the meeting. And you're like, where is everybody else? You're like, they just don't come. They just don't understand it, right? So getting that word out, getting it growing, right? Do I know what I have installed in my operations? And that goes back to like the adjutant general's piece, right? Do I understand what I have in my network? Does my ISSO, do my SSPs, do my security staff, do my CISO, does the C-suite understand what is there and what needs to be monitored and what needs to be protected so they can make recommendations? Everybody knows that trying to get funding for, you know, cyber protection stuff is very hard, right? You have to do all your risk assessments and like, well, how much is it going to cost me if I don't have that protected, right? How much is it going to cost you if you don't have your facilities control device not protected, right? That becomes a huge thing, right? That can impact everything else that falls underneath it. So understanding that. Getting the facilities folks in the communications with that, right? Getting them to understand. I think we had somebody, like a couple people from facilities. We do supply chain analysis a little bit, but we're not at the level it needs to be. We bought stuff from Alibaba or AliExpress. Everybody know what AliExpress is? It's the way to get hacked fastest. Mm-hmm. So we got some stuff in. We got these little light switches that you plug your plug into it, and you plug it into the wall. It doesn't have a battery in it. You click it. It sends a little LoRaWAN signal across to it, and it turns it on and off for you, right? When we got it into the country, the custom sheet, the packing sheet, said it was a beer can shower holder, right? Which is, we're like, why the hell does it say beer can shower holder? Well, guess what? Those guys over there, those guys and gals know how to get stuff past customs. If it was like an electronics device, it would probably get pulled and inspected, and there's a bunch of other things inside it that would have to be, you know, checked. So they just label it something else. Guess what the customs people do? Beer can shower holder. I need to get me one of those, and throw it. It gets mailed. Gets sent, right? So bypassing those. Guess how many people buy those? a ton, right? You go into it. My CTO for the company had one in the space. We had it attached to one of the lights at the front of our classroom so we could turn just that light off for like presentations and everything else, right? Like, hey, dude, you need to get it out of here. He's like, well, I bought it off of AliExpress. And we're like, yeah, that's what we're using to teach people not to do, right? So not everybody understands those types of pieces. And you put them in your home all the time, too. So all the light bulbs, all the smart devices, everything else that you get, all fall in the same boat, right? What data about my system is exposed or available, right? That's one of the things he was going to do. It's a data problem, right? Just like everything else that we talk about like on the enterprise side. But it's also things like the DAM list. It's the Superfund sites. It's all those different things that we don't normally think of as being critical to our operations or critical to our daily lives. Like, none of you will drive home or be driving someplace in the next month and not see a dam and go, I wonder if that's bad, right? Because you saw it. But think about how many people outside the room that just drive by and be like, oh, look, it's a dam. Cool, we should go fishing there sometime, right? Right? Do we have true cybersecurity control system policies in place? Do those policies convey over to your OT side, right? Everybody knows you have to change the default username and password on a PC, and your laptop, and your switches, and your routers. How many times do we change the default username and password on a touch panel or another device you're putting into it? We don't enforce that. We don't see it. Because why? We probably are not ever going to log into it. And if it is somebody logging into it, it's probably going to be the contractor who put it in, right? But it doesn't mean that an adversary is not going to stumble across it, like I stumbled across the touch panel at a car wash, right? Or stumbled across the intake monitoring system at a major airport, right? The trust, that's the biggest thing too, is like the trust. Do I trust the devices in that environment? We don't know where they come from because they're all made where? In China, predominantly in China, right, or Taiwan. We don't know who's had access to them. We don't know what they're building into it. They're built right along the same facilities as what? Things like Huawei, right? So what's to say that they're not being, manipulated in some form or fashion? Do I have the right documentations for my systems, right? Do I fully understand my network access issues to those devices, right? What are my training focuses? Again, this goes back to understanding, getting the workforce to understand what's going on, both on like the defensive and offensive side, right? It's like, what are the specifics I need to understand? Not just like the annual, information assurance training or annual IT cyber training and everything else, but what is included in that, right? You were gonna ask a question? Statement?
Is there actual, affordable SCADA system training under SANS? Because I know SANS has it, but I'm not really into SCADA at all, so just asking a question. What was that?
Yeah, so the national labs are trying to roll out some training. I just met with DHS this weekend at DEF CON. They're trying to roll some out. The SANS piece is again, love SANS to death. Great training, everything else. Super expensive and not geared towards the masses. It's geared towards IT cybersecurity folks transitioning into that environment, right? So if you can't take an integrator and put them at the SANS 515 class because they're going to be blown away because they have no idea what Wireshark is to begin with, much less anything else you're going to talk about. Like OSI level, I just take this yellow cord and stick it in, the light comes on, and poof, magic, right? So while SANS is great at that, there's not a lot on the rest of the world. The hardware developers like Siemens and Allen Bradley, they've been pushing some training and trying to get their integrators like knowledge up and be able to get that to customers as well. But again, that goes back to big hardware sellers selling it to mom and pop shops like the hardworking guy in Dalzell, South Carolina, who's just trying to make a living, who again has no idea what you're like cybersecurity. I can't even get my phone to work, right? Half the time, I got to go to my kids. So he's not going to pay attention to all that. He's just like, yeah, I shove it in. I get paid hourly. I got to go. I got to get to the next spot. and all stakeholders communicating accordingly, right? And that aerospace ecosystem. One of the things we've been telling airports and staff there is like, as TSA mandates these certain requirements, you have to start communicating to your tenants what is expected of you, right? When TSA says, report all cyber incidents within 24 hours, what is a cyber incident to the barista at Starbucks, right? It could be a major, right, infiltration going through that. I'm not picking on Starbucks, but it could be a major jump point in an airport to be able to get to the baggage handling system, to be able to get to a ground device, to be able to get to an airplane, right? So if they don't know what a cyber event is, how are they supposed to report it? And if we don't give them training, we don't include them in what the policies are, what all these other pieces are, right? We don't stand a chance moving forward in that. Now, move that to all 15 other critical infrastructure areas.
So usually when you're looking at ICS systems, at least from like a defensive standpoint, it's already difficult enough to get a client to take very egregious security concerns seriously. How do you communicate these kinds of like very granular things and get them to actually act on it?
I bring the examples like I showed you guys today, and they're like, I know where you get your gas at, right? And this is what I do. And this is, you may not think about it. Your operator might not be thinking about this, but I know how to stop the gas flow at your facility, right? You just have to go in and show them and start those different pieces and show them. You know, I had the city of San Antonio, like their staff came, like the mayor and everything else. They would come up to DC every year and go meet Congress and everything else. And they came over to the lab, and I was like, this is how easy it is to take down infrastructure in San Antonio, and showed them. And they're like, oh. They immediately went back and they started developing policies and like, how do we protect that in place? So you just have to show them. That's where you get in that little borderline. Like, do I show everybody in this briefing that I can get on that device? Yeah, I show it.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many, you're just scratching the surface, obviously,
Oh.
but there's so much to dig into. But, you know, like a lot of times the OT folks don't even have budget. You know, all the budgets with IT.
Yep.
So they have to go convince the IT folks to fund the OT project. And the IT folks don't understand OT. And so they just want to go in there and do like a message scan or something like that. You know?
Yeah, that's one thing we focus on. Like we do some training, but we try and take traditional cyber defensive operators and show them what not to do when they go into do assessment of a facility. Like an integrator might, I use the example, we've seen it. An integrator might put in and be listening on a PLC for a particular flag to be set, and that flag might be a 0, right, to turn it off. But if they don't want to account for null packets, what happens if I do a null packet sweep to enumerate the network? I start turning things off because that device treats a null packet as a 0, right? You can kill people, you could destroy equipment, you can do a lot of different things. And if you tell a traditional enterprise cybersecurity person, like, you can destroy things with a null packet sweep, they're gonna be like, what? What? Get out of here. I'm not gonna hurt anything, right? So we have to show them those pieces and explain why and demonstrate it. Yes?
In light of your previous presentation about AI, do you have any AI or ICS data specific use cases for AI?
That goes back to, yeah, so AI automated like intrusion detection systems at very high level, right? Because when we do start putting these things into a SIEM, we start driving the data volumes up, right? We start generating alerts, and we start generating a lot of different things. So that's where we need to like augment those folks with AI capabilities to be able to do that and to be able to triage what's going on and be able to identify it, to be able to kind of, like we were talking about in the last session about being able to do active responses or AI initiated responses to threats. Well, if the threat is against the PLC that controls the life support system, do you really want the AI shutting it down? No, we probably don't want that type of active response. So there, even more so on the critical infrastructure side, there's a lot of things we have to be conscious of, ethics, social, economic side. In the back? Yeah, we actually were working, in a discussion with DISA, we were talking about supply chain analysis. And they were like, well, you can't do supply chain analysis the way you want to do it because of compliance reasons. And like, we can't do intelligence gathering against U.S. companies. And they're like, but you have to inspect the product. It's not doing it against the companies, it's against the products. And they're like, but it's against the company. So there's like policy changes and some other things, like opening up the aperture on what we're trying to do with it and everything else that need to occur. But it is, like, I forget somebody over here, this is just scratching the top of it. The breadth of capabilities that we see coming at us and the flaws in those pieces and the lack of understanding of it is just immense. So I appreciate everybody coming out. I'll hang out for a little while and I'll be outside if you have any other questions.